In the passage that we are studying in the Life Divine, Sri Aurobindo is describing the emergence of religion as one of four different lines of development by which nature brings human beings to the awareness of their deeper spiritual possibilities. Subsequent to religion is occultism, spiritual philosophy, and then direct spiritual experience. The other three he will discuss later, but at the moment, in the part we are now reading, in the paragraph that we concluded last time, Sri Aurobindo described the early phase of emergence of religion, which began with a first awakening to a rudimentary spiritual consciousness with a vague sense of the infinite and invisible around the physical being. So what we recognize is humanity is at a stage where the physical being is first. There is no direct awareness of the spiritual. Nature is trying to take you to the spiritual. She begins with the physical, looking out through the physical senses. But at that time, since the intellect is not yet formed, and the intellect will be the link between the spiritual and the material, the intellect not being formed, there is a subliminal sensation, there is a vital intuition mixed into the life force, and through these, there is a sense of something. And so it is a vague sense of the invisible and the infinite surrounding, and the sense of limitation and impotence of the human mind and will in relation to that and in relation to the whole world and the powers which are out there working in the world. From there, he begins bit by bit to enter or to look for means of communication with these powers, to propitiate them, to bring them to his aid, and tries to find out what are the means by which these things could be made useful. There is not yet a strong development of reason, and so there is a reliance on a kind of a supra-physical vision or knowledge. He attempts to extend a power of intuition and instinct, which are common with the animal, which the human being has inherited, the same instinct by which the animal senses danger of an earthquake several days before sometimes, which in the human at that primitive stage is still vivid. And with that same instinct, now it senses danger, it senses discomfort, it senses opportunities or something good that is coming or hidden. And so he works to extend this faculty. And as the mentalization begins to happen more and more, though on a weekly mental state, there is an attempt to organize all these, to organize these subliminal experiences and formulating, describing, and transmitting into the collective. With this, you see the first beginnings of an organized framework of religion. The intuitions which he has received by contact with nature, the mind has systematized. And so this point is important, the phrasing of Sri Aurobindo's wording. He says, the intuitions that he thus received by contact with nature. And here is a clue. Last time we dwelt much on the overall movement of the thought, but there were important suggestions which we did not pause upon, which now we can look back. This intuitions that he thus received by contact with nature, it says a lot. You can be sitting in your cave, whether it is the cave in the rock or it is your cave in your concrete building of the concrete jungle, you don't get that intuition as easily. You go out into nature and it is as if the deeper, finer sensibilities open out. The moment you go out into fresh air and open nature, your heart seems as if to open out. Your consciousness opens out. Even if you're conscious of your subtle being, it opens out like that to receive and to embrace nature. It happens automatically. We may not make any conscious effort. And in that very act, there's a contact, there's an opening, and nature also reaches out to embrace you. And in that point of contact is a communication that takes place. You come back to your city house, you tend to close once again, getting into a kind of a protective shell. Nature cannot reach out to you easily. Well, she is not even present easily. You notice there are spaces in nature which are also more conducive. If you go to an open space which has only grass and a few scrub bushes, doesn't help much. You go to an old, ancient tree, and as you approach it, you feel the wisdom of the tree. You lean back against the tree, or you go to sleep, to rest under the tree, and you wake up with some dream or some inspiration or intuition, not knowing where it came from. And if you're a little sensitive, you might say, oh, the tree gave it to me, or nature gave it to me in that space. For those who have some experience of wandering in forests, today we don't have that, unfortunately. It should be part of our compulsory education. But when you wander into forests, you feel distinctly certain spaces which are as if more sacred, others which are almost as if empty. And the spaces which are felt more sacred, you know each time you come back to it, you can feel this so distinct. And that's where you receive these intuitions. Sometimes even there is a physical representation of that sacred space, suddenly in the middle of a forest, a clearing. As if because of the sacred presence there, the trees themselves form a circle in their growth, and nothing grows in the center to hold the sacred space or to form a covering protecting it. And these things happen spontaneously. You find stones sometimes, almost as if by chance arranged in some manner in a similar protective space, or represented sometimes by an unusual rock formation. Here is a complete flat desert, and in the middle of the desert, a sharp, rising rock cliff becoming a flat mountain top. How could that be? It cannot be by chance. There must be something in the earth's working. And even if you rationalize it, it's volcanic action. There must be something there in that upward surge of Earth's volcanic action that held a special power that made for this to be different from all the rest. And you experience it intuitively as you walk there, enter there. But the key here is this: received by contact with nature. When you consciously wish to receive an intuition, this is one of the best ways. And this is why in many of the old cultures, when people had a problem to solve, a really difficult one, they would go out into nature. And the general tradition you will see across different cultures, the common element would be being out there for 3 days. And we can think about why 3. We touched upon the symbolism of 3 last time. But there is as if a sense that when you first enter the space, you're carrying too much of yourself. And it takes about a day for that to reduce. By the second day, the presence of the space, the sacred space, now begins to fill you and begins to grow in strength. And by the third day, you have been replaced and the presence is strong enough. And that's when you can have the direct communion. We have also heard of many sages, many saints at various times who would go into the forest to commune for a higher inspiration. Some of them did it formally. They would tell their disciples, now I have to go, and just vanish into the forest and then come back with knowledge. You see even in the Abrahamic tradition, Moses going to the top of a mountain all alone for a number of days. But always the idea is when you approach nature and open yourself, that intuition comes more easily. So these intuitions received by contact with nature, again suggesting nature is leading humanity through these contacts. Remember, the whole description is of how nature is pushing human evolution. And so nature finds those spaces most easy to infuse her suggestions and influences. So this active and ready power of intuition gives also a clear sense of the powers behind the ability to communicate. And then the mind, which has now half developed, is trying to organize and utilize this knowledge. And you recall two words we dwelt on last time: effective and canalizing means for a dynamic utilization of this knowledge. And I dwelt on the sense of canalizing, the focusing of energy. But what is the best way to focus? If there is a power, let's say, spread out in the forest, how would you direct it? How would you bring it to action in a specific location? What would be the means to canalize? And we can conceive of objects. For example, you take a stone from the forest or a branch from the tree that represents the tree or carries its influence. But ultimately, this is the great conclusion we come to. The most effective vehicle for canalizing any consciousness is the human being. We are as if a focal point. And whether it is canalizing a universal energy drawn from the environment or it is a spiritual energy drawn from above, we are the most natural canalizing means, similar to if we take an image of a lightning rod that reaches out and allows the lightning to be attracted and drawn down, canalized in a narrow, clear, forceful action. We are that ultimately. So the means of canalizing always eventually come back to ourselves. And so this becomes the basis for early magic and early forms of occultism. Then another next sentence which he observes, at some time it must have dawned on him that he had something in him which was not physical, a soul that survived the body. And so this canalizing means is what brings the focus back to yourself. And you being the agency for the magic or the occultism, you realize that within you is a power which is different or greater, which can change things, which can direct this canalization or this action. And so there must be something within me which is more free, which has the ability to assert its freedom on nature. But he uses this phrase, at some time it must have dawned on him. Unfortunately, when we read casually, we tend to take it merely as a figure of speech. Because, well, that's what we have been reading. It dawned on me. But why did we ever use that phrase to begin with so that it became a figure of speech? Why don't you say it hit me or it fell into me? Which also you may use if that's the nature of the experience. But when you say it dawned on me, there is the sense of the light rising at dawn. Through the night, there's this darkness where you cannot see, you know a little bit, but you don't even know what you know, and you don't know what you don't know. That's the darkness of the night. And as the dawn begins, the sun is not yet fully out, just the first light begins to dawn. It's a gradual process which speeds up. But as the light grows, suddenly you begin to see, there is something here, there is something there. And with light, everything becomes more illuminated. And so there's a similar process that takes place in the evolution of the mind. At its crude level, the mind does not have the ability to receive a more direct light. It must work by its own instinctive pushes and drives. But when either there is the dawning of the intelligence or above that a higher intuition, that light begins to fill and suddenly the mind begins to see. Things which earlier you could have only speculated now become obvious. There's a very interesting story narrated which shows the power of this dawning process. There's a man who is on the edge of a cliff. He slips and falls, grabs hold of a branch. And now he's hanging off the cliff from a branch, except the whole thing takes place at night. So he's waiting, calling for help. Nobody responds. And all through the night, he's struggling to just survive, and his grip is slipping. And as the dawn begins, the light comes, the light grows. He looks down, and his feet are barely half a foot above the ground. If only he knew, but he could not know. The power of the dawn, nothing changed in you, or rather, you didn't do anything. The light came in and revealed to you something which now you say is obvious. So much of our modern conversation centers around what is obvious. And often you look at a situation and you say, it's obvious this fellow is lying. It's obvious that that is going to happen or not happen. And someone else says, no, it's not obvious to me. Why? Because there's a difference of the perception, or even there might be errors, but discounting for errors, there is something which in you dawns that makes it obvious, and until it dawns in another, it is not obvious. But the very fact that you say obvious, the person spontaneously tends to identify with what you're thinking or seeing and may catch a glimmer of that and say, oh yes, now that you point out, you are right, it is obvious. So this sense of dawn is not merely a figure of speech, not merely an image, it's an actual experience of a light that is filling from above, which is not your light, which can actually transmit from mind to mind, which can spread in a collective, even into a civilization, and awaken a people. And the action of that descending light may be either a slow process of nature, or it may be accelerated by some divine beings, either incarnated or not. It may be a human being, let's say a sage who lives in the collective, who may not be known, but as a result of his invoking and holding that light, it reflects in the whole collective to some degree at least. Or he may be separately living from the collective in a cave that the collective knows nothing about, and yet the fact that he has the light, he may choose to spread it or imprint it in this collective or on humanity. Or from above, a non-incarnate being also, or the divine movement that sends down a light that awakens the people. So this is a key process in evolution that we do not recognize the importance of. So much of human evolution has actually been led by such dawning movements. So this is the second important insight. The practical use for us is, once we recognize the value of this, we can ask for the dawn. When you have a problem, make your mind very quiet, turn your mind upward and say, give me the light, show me the way, make it reveal to me. And if you wait quietly, maybe it needs 3 days, maybe you need to go into the forest or not, it doesn't matter, but the state of receptivity allows for that light to come, and it dawns. And when it dawns, you say, now I know, it's obvious. Why didn't I see it before? So the dawning awakens to this idea that there is something within that survives the body, which then is supported by supernormal experiences. And we dwelt last time on this sense that the very fact that you try to know something deeper in the supernormal makes active those faculties, and they begin to develop. And he recognizes very quickly there are elements within him which resonate with things outside, good and bad, and so on. All this, he says, brings you to this point of evolution where so would begin his religio-ethical formations and his possibilities of spiritual experience. You're on the brink of this. And what have you got on the brink of this? An amalgam of primitive intuitions, occult ritual, religio-social ethics, mystical knowledge or experiences symbolized in myth. So these are the 4 things which have been amalgamated. And again we have to pause to question why this word amalgam. It's interesting, when you go to the root, the word has a very clear sense. In modern usage, we use it loosely. If at all we use it, amalgam is just a mixture. You could have said a mixture of. What's the difference between amalgam and mixture? In fact, we do preserve this word still in modern usage, but only when you go to the dentist. And the dentist says, I will put an amalgam. So first of all, the difference between mixture and amalgam has this character. A mixture can be I take a little bit of sand, take a little bit of stones and mix it all. In the mixture, things are mixed, but they remain distinct. So a mixture of many ideas would have distinct character of each of the ideas. The whole would be a chaotic or organized mixture. So what he's describing is not a mix of primitive intuitions, occult ritual, ethics, or mystical experience. It's an amalgam, and an amalgam is used for metals, where you mix metals until they merge into each other to be indistinguishable. So it's a metal alloy. And an alloy, you cannot make out which metal is separate from the other. You have to do a special analysis, if at all, to be able to distinguish them. And the second character of the alloy is that the total has characters different from each of the separate pieces. When they blend into each other and become a new alloy, the overall characteristic of the alloy is fundamentally new and not a combination of the previous metals. So, for example, you could take an alloy of iron and mix into it certain elements of phosphorus or some other fine impurities, and the result you get is stainless steel. What makes it stainless? It doesn't rust anymore. Neither phosphorus nor iron nor the other impurities would have that character. And yet the mix has this feature. But amalgam has an even more special meaning. It's not just an ordinary alloy. He could have used the word an alloy of these things. Amalgam specifically represents an alloy that has a primary component of mercury and or silver. So often it is a mix, a blending alloy of mercury and silver, or it could be either mercury and silver with other elements, or simply just mercury with those other elements. And that rings a bell. Remember, mercury has a very strong importance in symbolic knowledge of the old... Yes, what's the tradition? Alchemic tradition. In alchemy, you have this idea of silver representing a special substance, which by going through a series of purificative and transmutative processes can become gold. In one of the very famous books in India on alchemy, Rasayana Shastra, it's also the basis for all of modern chemistry because it describes how to alter properties of things. But it describes 16 steps through which mercury has to be purified, modified, etc. Now, if you look at the character of the steps, it maps out perfectly the yogic process. So first step, purification. Then you make it stronger. Then you give to it life. And the mercury becomes living mercury. And then subsequently, again, there are combinations of purifications and infusing more power until around step 12, they say the mercury actually is now seen to be alive and brilliant and bright, as if it's glowing with force. And already there, it can be used for some magical effects. And if you go all the way to the 16th step, it becomes gold. If you think about the whole as a series of yogic steps, it could be symbolic. It has also a physical result, but it has a biological character in that once it crosses step 12, it is supposed to be a living thing. You cannot treat it purely as a physical object. It's a living substance. And at some point, it becomes gold when it is divine. Symbolically, at least physically. So in the alchemical tradition, there is a deep yogic content or a psycho-spiritual content of knowledge, which also maps to a physical process and therefore chemical and other knowledge, including an element which is chemical biological because there is an element of life. And they say at that point, if you take that mercury, it can invigorate the body. If you take mercury as it is, it's a neurotoxin. It will harm you. It will make you lose your mind because It damages the nervous system and the brain. But once it has gone through all that, it makes the body so strong and virile and capable of living long and free of all diseases and so on. The descriptions are very promising, except it's difficult to get there. But why is this important? Because in the amalgam is the first movement of this transformation process. And so when Sri Aurobindo is using this word here, when he says, an amalgam of primitive intuitions, occult ritual, social ethics, mystical knowledge or experiences symbolized in myth, what's he describing? A first step of the transmutation process. What has come now as a religion has the potential of growing all the way to the level of gold through transmutation, which would represent the spiritual full unveiling, the divinization literally, the transformation literally. Of course, there are many steps. We're still very far away. But the word amalgam captures this suggestion that what has so been created, which we might reject as a primitive, superstitious ritual or belief, is actually a starting point for nature's deeper evolution, and the potential is there. So, if you pause at a word like that and go deep into it, you discover the brilliance of Sri Aurobindo's insight when he's seeing all this. If he were to now describe all this, it would be another whole paragraph. People already complain it's too long, too detailed. So he throws in the word amalgam. And if you pause and think and feel why, and you discover that whole line of knowledge which is hidden in this one word. And then he says, mystical knowledge or experiences symbolized in myth, but with their sense preserved by a secret initiation and discipline. Why do you need to do that? Why secret initiation? Why this secret discipline? Of course, you can say it is because there can be misuse of the occult knowledge especially, and the symbolism involved in the occult knowledge. One of the things you will see in the West is the occult content of some of the rituals of the church are co-opted by a darker satanic ritual. They will take exactly the same thing that the church does and reverse everything. They'll make the cross upside down. They will recite the verses backwards. Where you're supposed to give, they will take, and where you're supposed to sanctify, they will desecrate, and thus create the opposite. But the symbolism is the common one, but for a completely opposite outcome. And it's very simple. If you think about the knowledge behind this, it was very easy to misuse. And so there was a necessity to protect many elements. Equally, there was another aspect which he does not dwell upon here. Those who had at first these deeper intuitions and insights, and even some kind of a more developed knowledge, were as human beings very different from the general mass. We must recognize that in earlier phases of human development, those who stood out were always significantly standing out. Those in whom the first awakenings of nature have begun were always too different from the rest. And so often they became representatives, shamans, sorcerers, magicians, medicine people, whatever terms given. But the way they felt, saw, and experienced was too much for the common man to accept. And so there had to be this double language, symbolic language. We see this in the Vedic tradition so obviously. The rishis themselves, having access to realms of spiritual experience so far above, over a humanity which is not even sufficiently intellectualized. What do? You only describe the symbols of that domain in the physical domain, and the physical ritual is given as a means of accessing something of that power in an externalized humanity which is unable to go within. In the same yoga tradition, the knowledge also is taught that there is such a thing as an outer ritual and an inner ritual. And it is only the most advanced who are capable of doing the inner ritual. So we have stories, for example, and I heard one many years ago, of so-and-so great saint, sage in South India. He was so great that while others had to bring coconuts and flowers and light a lamp, do the puja in the temple and do the offering to get their change or result of change of consciousness or spiritual benefit, this man would stand before the idol, close his eyes, and at best you saw his lips mumble a little bit, and he would do the entire ritual internally. Now, obviously, people think this, that inside he would light the lamp, inside he would do his rotation of the lamp, offer the flowers. No, that's not what the inner ritual is. It's not a replica in your mind of a physical ritual. It is the thing which you do internally, which is represented in the physical symbol. And what is the lighting of the lamp? The opening of your heart and your aspiration and intensification of the aspiration. What is the movement of offering of the flowers or the fruits and the coconut? It is the placing of yourself before the divine and the complete self-giving and consecration, down to the tiniest parts, each flower, vegetable representing, symbolizing powers of your consciousness or parts of your being. The most obvious symbol for the coconut is your head or the ego, if it's the mental ego, which is broken before the divine, and so on. The idea being, what he did was fundamentally so different, so essential in its and formless in its character, that to tell someone who is unable to hold attention inside wouldn't make sense, and it would be inaccessible to people. And so they were given an external symbol. What did I do? I lit my lamp of aspiration and opened my heart. What should you do? Light your lamp and open the doors, enter the temple or enter the sanctum sanctorum, but with a pure heart. So a link is given of the psychological component, but common man is able to act only outside with the attention turned out. And only those who are able to turn attention within and become conscious of what's happening within could be taught this deeper knowledge. So it's not from a need for secrecy, but from an inability for people to understand and experience that this separation was kept earlier. So preserved by secret initiation and discipline. And then it has to be passed on, because this can die with a person. Because what you live has to be transmitted. If you were to write it, you couldn't convey enough. Or you could write and only someone who was ready for that could understand. Others would misrepresent or reduce it to only a superficial ritual, as often happens with the Vedic descriptions. There are descriptions where the rishis, while making an offering, will say, give me horses, give me cows. What do rishis need horses and cows for? And now we have the horses, they say. They exclaim, we have lots of horses, we have lots of cows. Doesn't make sense. Until you go to the etymology of the word and realize they're speaking of the spiritual light and spiritual power, which is invoked and which comes streaming into them, and then they affirm and fix that which has been received. And how do you write that? Well, they did write it in the Veda. What happens when people read it today? They say, oh, horses and cows, these are primitives. You don't get it unless someone has that experience. So it was essential to transmit the experience in another who would be worthy or who was ready. But in the declining phase of human evolution, they did not get sufficient worthy vessels. And so again and again the knowledge would be lost, and again to be regenerated by special emanations born to bring back something of that truth. And we see here in modern times, Sri Aurobindo re-establishing the deeper spiritual content of the Vedic knowledge, as at the same time you will see Swami Dayananda 100 years ago making that first movement to bring that forward, including, he says, there's so much scientific knowledge in the Veda. And this was 100 years ago, and people said, what does he mean? More recently, Maharshi Mahesh Yogi, who took this kind of knowledge into the West, brought it, made it more accessible to the world, documented the benefits of some of those practices, and so on. So the need for bringing back and re-enlivening that knowledge becomes necessary precisely because it is not something which can be transmitted by writing or just talking about it. And so the secret initiation and discipline by which you become ready, and the initiation by which the knowledge is transmitted or imprinted by one who owns or possesses it, it can be infused into another who is ready. So all this, he says, in the beginning, these elements were no doubt crude and poor and defective, but they acquired depth and range and increased in some cultures to a great amplitude and significance. Three words he has used: crude, poor, and defective. Crude because what you have got does not capture all the finer nuances, it just captures a few elements. Poor because there is no appreciation even of all the rest of the riches of knowledge and experience that is waiting. It stops there. Defective because even it is wrong in many elements, not realizing the errors. But in time, in some spaces, in some cultures, they acquire depth and range to a great amplitude and significance. So Sri Aurobindo doesn't use great casually. We see this in certain spaces. In India particularly, the form that it took, and particularly in the Vedic age, and subsequently in pockets around at various stages. You will find in Europe similarly certain spaces where suddenly there was this intense efflorescence and then it fades out and as it spreads out. You do find equally cultures where it never grew beyond that base. In some parts of Africa, where you will still see the old rituals, and they may go back many thousands of years, there's even a great power and an occult power of action, but it has as if frozen, not gone further. In other parts of Africa, it went further and again stopped. In Egypt, which we also recognize as a part of Africa, it took a very strong turn, but at some point digressed from the spiritual turn into the occult, and then broke up as a result. And again, there was an attempt to bring it back into the spiritual. This was done in the time of Akhenaton, who tried to re-establish the worship of the sun and the central divine principle, and brought back the Vedic symbol, which Egypt originally had in its formulation, but which was lost. But it couldn't hold of its own, and then it faded out and completely was lost at some point. So what you see is nature herself pushes in some spaces where she feels a people can catch a certain aspect, she pushes that. Or she tries to build a people who would be ready for that deeper turn. Often this maps with the physical space. Now you've seen that being in nature helps for the opening of the heart, opening of the inner senses or the deeper intuitions. So spaces which naturally are conducive to that, you will find people grow into those. In the forest often, at the top of mountains, where there's a rarefied consciousness and atmosphere, on the beaches, not spaces which are harsh and difficult in the winter. So you see much more development in the tropical regions where you don't have to struggle to survive, and so on. So there is a mapping obviously to also the geographical circumstances. Some of the rivers have a spiritual force, and so on the borders of those rivers you'll find more of the people receiving the dawning light, whereas other rivers they may not have so much. By going to the root processes, Sri Aurobindo frees you from the appearance of these processes. If you looked only at appearances, you wouldn't understand why here it happened, there it didn't, or why here it took this form and there that form. But once you go to the root, it's obvious, and the rest is only a matter of specifics of that time or that space. Now comes so what we see here, as the human consciousness evolved, so did this capacity of organizing the religious form, and the access, the turn towards the spiritual also grew. At this point, a reasonably developed first level of mind has come, which has organized this body of knowledge. But now comes the second phase, which breaks away from this. All this was a build-up. The next phase will break what was built up to create something else instead. But as the mental and life development increased, this is the next paragraph, For that is nature's first preoccupation in man, and she does not hesitate to push it forward at the cost of other elements that will need to be taken up fully hereafter. Parenthetical statement. There is a tendency towards intellectualization. So the sentence is basically, as the mental and life development increased, there is a tendency towards intellectualization, and the first necessary intuitive, instinctive, and subliminal formations are overlaid with the structures erected by a growing force of reason and mental intelligence. So you had earlier structures, now reason has come into its place, the intellect organizes things and puts the superstructure on top. The problem is those superstructures being rational and these substructures being much more intuitive, instinctive, and subliminal, they are inherently incompatible. So the superstructure tends to want to break these substructures or discard them or reject what cannot be rationalized sufficiently or what cannot be formalized by the intellect. And so you begin to lose what was built up actually. This is the interesting passage now. So here's the parenthetical statement Sri Aurobindo throws in between is also extremely important. The moment he says mental and life development increased, and then he says, for that is nature's first preoccupation in man. And she does not hesitate to push it forward at the cost of other elements that will need to be taken up fully hereafter. We realize man is a special creature compared to other animals. In each animal, nature has a different objective to push through. If in the deer, it pushed through a particular force of swiftness and elegance of the leap and flow of action. If in the elephant, it pushed a more solid, deep, slow, lumbering content that holds and maybe even has an opening to a larger wisdom of a first level of intellect forming in animals. In the human being, she has decided this is going to be the instrument for the full development of the intellect. And so here, the force is always trying to push forward the intellect and life at the cost of other elements. And she doesn't mind if you push forward at the cost of other elements, knowing that later on she will turn back and bring those elements. This is a characteristic of nature, and we have to recognize, and this explains a lot of peculiarities of evolution. Evolution is not merely survival of the fittest, bit by bit, building slowly, regularly, going one step at a time. Evolution is driven by this push of nature that can sometimes be in a hurry and skip steps. And having skipped steps, find itself unstable and then turn back to rebuild those steps and strengthen them in order to be able to move further. And so with the development of the intellect, this is what happens. It has built an intellect and then had made a first attempt at intuition, and this goes back many thousand years. Having reached the intuitive, she realizes the intellect is not sufficiently strong and integrated with the physical consciousness. And so the intuition does not have a strong instrument to act in the world. And she allows a fallback to intellect and even below intellect to integrate this part which was missing between the intellect and life force and body and senses. Rebuilds that and then pushes forward again to develop the intellect now on a more solid basis. Sri Aurobindo points to this as the only explanation for the modern phase of humanity where in the last 200 or 300 years you find this intellect suddenly bursting out. And he says, even if you take somebody coming from a tradition in which there is no intellectual training at all, certain tribes in Africa, where the whole relation was with nature and with the animals, no power of intellect given any value. You take them out from that space, and within a generation or two, suddenly you find the intellect bursting with full power as anywhere else. And he says you cannot explain this rapidity of emergence unless that power was already present in that culture and in humanity generally. but that had been developed in an earlier phase when nature found the development was insufficient, something missing, and so she had to fall back to integrate and now catches up. And so she can catch up in a couple of generations, what otherwise earlier would have taken maybe many hundreds of generations to develop. And the same thing now from the intellect to the intuition, where earlier she had made that first attempt at intuition already. That capacity is there in the human mind and in the intellect. And so, as the intellect is sufficiently now developed and stabilized, she is pushing for the intuitive to emerge. But now, as it will emerge, it may catch up with what was done before, but must go much more. And that may not have been done yet. So, we will face more struggles in the intuitive emergence, or at least its higher perfection. But already by this time, if the human being is sufficiently conscious and able to take charge and lead his evolution consciously, we do not need to depend on nature's slow process. He can invoke a higher help, and by this interchange, rapidly develop what to nature would have taken maybe 1,000,000 years. So we are at this very interesting phase where the gaps which were there before, which prevented that higher development, have just been filled in. We have rapidly made a catch up with the power of the intellect, not everywhere in humanity, not equally in humanity, but broadly, and have this attempt to rise above intellect into intuition. So, but this parenthetical statement is so important because this nature does all the time. And she will do this in us also. And this has value for us in our own sadhana. Because of the effort we make for a rapid growth of evolution, and she will perhaps join in that effort, there may be steps skipped as you rise to certain experiences. And then, of course, you need to fall back, to reintegrate, to infuse something of that light into the lower parts, rebuild, realign those lower parts until the ascent can be made again now on a stronger footing. That movement which we may experience in our lifetime, happening within a few days or weeks or sometimes several months or years, that nature has been doing also in much longer spans, going across many generations, hundreds or thousands of years. So nature's first preoccupation in man is this mental and life development. And she doesn't hesitate to push it forward at the cost of other elements that will need to be taken up fully hereafter. And he's reminding you of this because what will happen next is when there is the development of the superstructure of the intellect, which breaks down the truth of the earlier subliminal and intuitive and instinctive insights. When those break, later the intellect will come into its own and say, but I'm missing something, and it will turn back at those very things it discarded. But now to find the truth in them and make that integration. So this statement is very important for understanding what happens later. And so these earlier substructures are overlaid with the structures erected by a growing force of reason and mental intelligence. What happens when the force of reason and mental intelligence grows in a people? Observe what happens in a teenager as they come into the power of their intellect, let's say after the age of 12, 13, 14. For each one, it's slightly different. Suddenly they realize this power of thought is so much fun. It's so much fun to argue. It's so much fun to prove someone wrong. It's so much fun to come on top in dominating with your ideas instead of with physical force, with vital force. Idea domination, idea collision, idea absorption, co-opting someone's idea, giving it a different turn and shape. Literally in the mind, you're doing things which the primitive man did with his hands or with his emotions and life force. And rapidly, within a few years, there is this ascent that takes place where the intellect comes into full force. At that time, this is the single most interesting thing. And this is what happens in humanity, in a culture, in a civilization, in an age where the intellect comes into force. And you see this, for example, in the 1800s in Europe with the emergence of science. and then it moves to the United States. Suddenly you have this scientists making extraordinary discoveries, sharing them, and the public is fascinated by these discoveries. And it looks like at this pace, every few years, we are making such gigantic breakthroughs. At this pace, we can conquer nature. Nature will no more prevent us. We can do anything. That's the feeling. There's a very interesting description when Nikola Tesla first created his AC generators and motors. From the Niagara Falls, wires brought the electricity all the way to New York City or to Chicago. And at that time, to bring electricity this distance was unheard of, because using DC current, you could go at most a mile or two, by which time the voltage dropped so much you had a dim bulb. You didn't have the brightness. And here at a distance far away, everything is dark. There was going to be a major exhibition, I believe it was in Chicago, and Nikola Tesla dramatically throws a switch and everything is brilliantly lit up like in daytime. And the entire crowd goes ooh and ah. And all the newspaper headlines are looking at this. You can make any space as bright as day at will by throwing a switch. What a power of the intellect. And it suddenly shakes up the whole culture. The whole civilization now turns and says, what more can we do? How far can we go? And there's the surging of the enthusiasm and excitement and the thrill of creating a future and envisioning, if I can do this now, what can I do in 5 years, 10 years? And there's still things which are considered impossible, such as flight. But when suddenly you see the flight, you say, yes, maybe this also, and maybe. And at some point, the high peaks of the speculative mind catch it in science fiction. They will not say, this is how it's going to happen, because you will be called crazy. But in my science fictional description, I can do all this. I will have anti-gravity flying around freely. And science says, maybe that's not possible. But somewhere at the back of the mind, you know it's possible and therefore you're conceiving of it. But this turn gives to the intellect such a great power that you don't need anything else. It is self-sufficient. What happens then? As man discovers the secrets and processes of physical nature, he moves more and more away from his early recourse to occultism and magic. Why do you need your magic and occultism? I can throw a switch and all the light comes on. I can heat a cold house just with the electricity that comes. And Tesla describes it like this. A single waterfall can light up the whole world. And he was describing the possibility of amplifying electricity. And he wanted to create amplifying transmitters to send out electricity to all the corners of the world. Anybody, anywhere could put up an antenna, receive the electricity, and light up his whole home. And interestingly, at that time, even there is this speculation. He says, with this electricity that I can hit the earth with, he was creating a resonance between earth below and the ionosphere, which is conductive, high up in the sky, about 60 kilometers or so. Between these two conductive layers is air which is non-conductive. So it becomes like a capacitor. And if there are two sheets like a capacitor, you can pulse electricity and it begins to resonate. And once it resonates, you can remove the electricity and the resonance continues. So his idea was, I will pulse the electricity, resonate the ionosphere, which spreads all around the earth, and anywhere on earth you can catch that pulsation and draw electricity. What an amazing idea. What a vision. Not only can draw electricity, by making fine variations on those pulsations, I can send voice and images, radio and television, internet of today. All these things were there 100 years ago. And he was building these. He was demonstrating the ability to pulse. With it came the possibility through pulsating to modify the weather. Because you could make the pulsations concentrate on one part of the ionosphere and make it expand or contract and modify airflows and control the weather. You see the power that you have. Why do you need your magic? Where you have to go through all those incantations and I need to rely on that one shaman who's able to call the rain sometimes, not always, and the shaman is not available. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. When with science, anyone can do it anywhere. You see the way the whole mind works. He moves more and more away from his early recourse to occultism and magic. The presence and felt influence of gods and invisible powers recedes as more and more is explained by natural workings, the mechanical procedure of nature. Where earlier you felt those gods, you felt that there were these beings and you could relate to them. They were invisible powers, but they were conscious powers and you could call for their aid. What you see instead is their physical process. The wind blows. I observe the wind blowing, and so I can tap the wind with my windmill or predict the wind. I don't need to control with my incantation, which probably may not even be valid because it doesn't make sense to a mind which has turned away from that sensitivity. So, the mechanical procedure of nature and explained by natural workings. So when the weather comes and there is rain, something changes, you say, that is the seasonal change because of Earth's tilt. Where earlier you could feel that winter was ending and spring was preparing to come. And when spring came, you could feel the joy and bursting of that life force. You could see it visually out of the soil, suddenly a burst of colorful flowers. And you felt it in your own body. Now your mind has been told, but it is only the normal rhythm because of Earth's tilt and the position of the sun. But is that so? If that were so, then your weather should be even everywhere on that particular latitude at least. It is not. Okay, so you have to explain that by saying, there's a mountain here, so the wind is forced to rise up, and when it rises up, it loses pressure or it changes temperature as a result of loss of pressure. Because of change of pressure, there is precipitation and the water condenses. So because of the mountain being here, there's more rain this side, less rain that side. Explanations of a process. Not recognizing that behind the process is a conscious being working out its free action through that process. Now what happens is, what you saw earlier as a conscious action of a being is reduced to a mechanical process, and science says that's how it is. That's how it will be anyway, with or without being, so throughout the being. But is that really true? What we find is, it's not entirely true. What we find in practice, and this of course requires a more developed experimentation and exploration, that in a space where science says it is impossible to have rain, you can have a group of people sit down and do a Havana and a Vedic ritual and invoke the rain to happen out of rhythm in a circumstance where science would have said it is not possible even there is not enough moisture in the air. How did they do it? When they make it happen, science will say, oh yes, but the rain happened because the wind modified its direction here, it brought this cloud and the cloud precipitated because of temperature change. But you started your ritual at 8 a.m. in the morning, you got the rain by evening. Science says yes, but the air process started changing already 2 days before. And so it was explained it was a coincidence. Except you couldn't have predicted it. And this is the weird thing with the weather. While on the one hand we're able to describe it, even from the description extend the prediction, we are unable to predict beyond 3 days. Beyond that, we are only tapping into past rhythms and anticipating or using models to project. But if you watch, let's say, a weather forecast and watch the week ahead, you will see every day the next few days forecast is modified. And at best it is accurate down to a day or two. At any point in between, things can change. Sometimes it can change within a day. So we've had this in many cases, and I can share this as an experience in spaces where we had people gathering for a special occasion during a rainy season. And everybody was so worried. We said to them, look, you can make a prayer to the rain, to the clouds and the rain, but be very clear of what you need. Specify the time that you don't want the rain and after what time the rains can start. But you must convey clearly. You don't say, no, I don't want rain. Then those beings say, well, I'm sorry, you have to have it because we need to do it. Earth needs it. You specify and give a reason why. We're doing this. This is a sacred occasion. It's not on our whim and fancy. For this special purpose, many people will gather with a great aspiration. So we ask that you cease the rain, not at that time, but a couple of hours before. And after such and such a time, we will become done and you can start the rain again. And with love, because they are conscious beings. You can't order them. You can request, and if you reach out with love, then they also respond with love. And you say, thank you. And so, many times, and I'm saying this, it's happened really many times, the rain stopped, bright sunlight, function completed, function is over, and suddenly the clouds gather and the rain start. There have been other cases where the clouds came, they just held back the rain. And when necessary, the rain started. And afterwards I said to them, please remember to thank. Tell them, give them the thanks. It's not just you made a request, they did it, they're not your servants. You thank them, they're friends, build a relationship. Of course, here in the ashram, it was even more dramatic. The most dramatic incident I had heard from the chief of engineering of the ashram department of construction. And they were building for Golconda. They were making this roof where you have to lay the roof cement in one continuous process. Otherwise, if you stop halfway, the joint will always have a crack and will leak. So you have to finish all in one go. They started the process and then the rain clouds started gathering. What do? You go to the mother. Mother, please, it will spoil the whole work. Mother says, okay, I will inform Sri Aurobindo because the rain gods listen to him much more. So she informs Sri Aurobindo and says, it must not rain until this is over. And he nods and continues with his work. After a while, the engineer told us the clouds gathered. They were so heavy, you could smell the rain, but not a drop came. At that point, interestingly, Sri Aurobindo sent word, have they finished yet? Meaning he was getting a lot of pushback from the rain gods, Okay. So they said, not yet, not yet. So the word went back. When finally the whole roof was finished, they covered the whole thing with the tarpaulin. Word went back. He took it, I believe, himself to the mother and said, Mother, it's over. It can rain now. Mother goes to Sri Aurobindo and says the work is over. Instantly, there was a massive downpour. And it was so massive, they said they never had rain so intense. And Mother explained that when you interfere with these processes, there's always a compensation. So you stopped it for long, so it came with greater force after. Now these are insights which the early occult and religious sensibility, the subliminal would have known. These are in fact one of the insights which we can dwell on. That you realize whenever you ask for something, there is always an exchange. And this is felt especially in nature. In nature, you will see there is no process which happens one way. Everything is two-way. Everything serves not one purpose, but multiple purposes. So you realize the moment you ask for an intervention, for an aid, you also have to give back something. What can you give back? So often that becomes the basis for rituals and propitiatory rituals. You offer something to the rain gods. What will be helpful for them? What would they want? So you have to find what represents for them something worthwhile, or they tell you, they reveal to you. So a lot of these rituals form in this way. But now science said, oh, it's just condensation of water, it's a natural process. I can go with my aeroplane and release iodide. What is the iodide? Silver iodide, fine crystalline powder. You release into the clouds and it causes precipitation and it rains. I can seed clouds at will and cause rain when I want. You don't need the shaman. In fact, what is this whole story about talking to rain god? It makes no sense. It is just a normal process that you're describing. So I give the example of how weather prediction fails beyond a certain short-term distance of time. I will share one incident which is... I don't think I would ever do it again, but it was once I was with my students in the school, and it was during a period, it was really, really, really hot. It was the peak of summertime. And they all said, we need rain, we need rain. And then I said to them, Mother had taught a mantra to invoke rain. As well, she taught a mantra to stop the rain. So I said, well, let's learn this. Let's do an invocation. So we sat there and we chanted. And about 15 minutes. And it was an intense call because there was a children's heart calling. And I said to the mother, please bless their call, otherwise they will be so disappointed. So it was on a Saturday morning. And then this ended. And then they said, well, now where's the rain? So I said, well, wait. It doesn't come immediately because it takes time for the clouds to come and then for the rain to come. So watch. Monday morning, there was such a massive downpour in the middle of summer. Such a massive downpour. But it was already a gap of 1.5 days. So I'm not sure if they connected it, that it was because of that call. But to me, it was obvious. It was in response to that intense call. But that's the problem also in any intervention, because even the rain gods have to initiate a movement if you want a proper rain. Of course, they can create instant precipitation. And in a clear sky, it's not difficult. Many shamans do that. They do an invocation and instantly there's a light precipitation. But a full rain, well, they need time to assemble also. By which time your scientist will say, oh yeah, but that's because of such and such process, and he'll explain it away. So now what happens to the substructure which was built up earlier? The presence and felt influence of gods and invisible powers recedes as more and more is explained by natural workings, the mechanical procedure of nature. But what remains when all the rest is thrown out? But he still feels the need of a spiritual element and spiritual factors in his life, and therefore keeps for a time the two activities running together. So you find the rational mind is throwing out everything else, but it's keeping something which is felt as a need, the spiritual. Because reason says, I am enough to replace all the rest. That gets thrown out. But I'm not enough to replace the spiritual component. So you'll find people have a rich, rational life and a quiet, personal, perhaps secret even, spiritual component to their life, which may take the form of a formal worship or some inner communion. The two remain. What happens to the rest, to the occult elements? But the occult elements of religion, though still held as beliefs or preserved, but also buried in rites and myths, lose their significance and diminish, and the intellectual element increases. Finally, where and when the intellectualizing tendency becomes too strong, there is a movement to cut out everything but creed, institution, formal practice, and ethics. Now you see this happening in Europe at the turn where the church was pushed out of the political power. There is an age of enlightenment, and with the enlightenment, it's the light of reason, not a spiritual light. And with it, the movement to cut out all the other elements. What remains of the church, if you see today? Creed. Here's a belief system. Christ died for your sins. You have to now submit to him if you want your sins to be taken up. If not, you'll be punished forever in hell. It doesn't make sense logically. But that's all that remains. You remove that, there'll be no church. So the creed element has to stay, which distinguishes it. Then there is the institution of the church, which still has its power, which still has its control. The church still maintains a focal point in smaller villages of being the registrar of births and deaths, for example, as a function which in other more secular institutions would become mayoral or the city and the government taking over. And it's still a link point for people to meet, at least in the smaller towns. How else, when else would they meet if there was not some event weekly that you met? Okay, you wait for festivals, but you don't have weekly festivals. So that becomes an occasion, an institution now to meet. And it was interesting for me. I attended a church practice in not the Christian church proper, but it was in the church which is created by the Self-Realization Fellowship. So when Paramahansa Yogananda taught yoga, it was among people who came from a strong Christian background. So he incorporated the vocabulary and elements from the Bible, and even certain elements of church practices which he didn't incorporate but which came in with the people got formalized later. So Although he never gave it the form of a church, they created a church, and it was interesting to go into their practice. It was a regular church type building, except that it had the deities of the SRF. The priest stood, as in any Christian church, at the entrance. As you walked in, he greeted each one politely. You went in, you had your sheet of paper of prayers, as in any Christian church, except now they were prayers of Yogananda. We recited as a group, and then whatever ceremony is completed, as you came out again, the priest was there to greet each one, thank them, build and hold a social network. All of these are now institutional elements. And formal practice, you have to say these prayers, you have to turn the rosary, or whatever the form it may be. In the Buddhist tradition, where it has become more formalized, you will find people turning the prayer wheel mechanically. They're walking by, they're looking elsewhere, but by the ritual practice, you may turn the prayer wheel. And ethics, you should not speak ill of others, your 10 commandments, do not covet another's, do not break your marriage, which is a sacrosanct entity, etc. But does any of that have to do with the original spiritual teaching? If you go back to the Christian context, did Christ speak of any of these things? Did he ever speak of a pope? Did he ever speak of Sunday service? Did he ever speak about all these? Probably not, or at best they would be derived from certain things he spoke. What he spoke of as love of God or for God, or some possibilities of the awakening of consciousness in the kingdom of God, is largely forgotten or held merely as something to be spoken out in the prayer. But this happens because of that strong intellectualizing tendency which has cut out everything else which doesn't make sense. But it still needs to hold the institution, without which, of course, there is nothing left. The element which is thrown out particularly is the occult knowledge and the particular aspect of deeper symbolism, mystical knowledge, the primitive intuitions. All those have gone out. Or they may remain at best in the form of a ritual where you still go through certain things. So when the Pope is elected, well, he is given his frock, he wears that. Why does he have to wear that dress? Why that color? Why that shape? Oh, it's tradition. But why did the tradition begin like that? You may say, okay, it was a pre-Christian institution which was co-opted by the Roman Empire. But why was it there before? So one of the things you will find in the Pope's cap is that it has a double structure. And if you trace it back to its source, it goes back all the way, and the earliest symbol you find is in Egypt, where the pharaoh had a double cap. There was a frontal part and a tapering part behind, which to him, and as you will see it in today's books, it's again secularized and intellectualized. They'll say he was the king of both upper kingdom and lower kingdom. So they divided Egypt into upper part of the Nile and lower part of the Nile. Since he ruled both, he had a double cap. Doesn't make sense. If at all there were two kingdoms and he conquered them, it would be one cap dominating all. Why maintaining duality if you have integrated it? Because the upper and lower didn't represent physical Egypt. The upper kingdom was the spiritual domain, lower kingdom was the physical domain. The king, who was also the priest at that time, represented the man who bridged the spiritual world and the material world. And so he held in his cap the symbolism of these two worlds that were bridged. He became the channel through which that higher would flow down into the lower. And therefore people bowed down before the king, held him in a divine reverence. Symbols of divinity were surrounding him, including gold, which physically represented substance which is divinized, and all other paraphernalia of the ritual flowed from that perception or symbol. Those elements got carried over through many transitions. They still survive. And maybe in that secret initiatory rites involved there in the church, they may still retain memory of it. But to the common man, at least, it's just tradition. And the word tradition says, I don't know how, but everyone did it, so I continue to do it. Even now, what happens next? Even the element of spiritual experience dwindles, and it is considered sufficient to rely only on faith, emotional fervor, and moral conduct. Again, to take the example in Europe, with this phase of hard science coming in, the church also becomes more reduced, and the teaching then becomes have faith in the church, in Christ, in the Bible, or whatever the element representing for that particular group, strong emotions, and live a good life. Be a good Christian. What does that mean? These are the moral conducts. And then what? What about spiritual growth? What about feeling closeness to the divine? It's not even spoken of. In the priestly tradition, the training is all about the ritual and how to manage your flock, how to build relationships, how to control people, direct their thinking. It's nothing to do with spiritual development. The priest is not required to grow spiritually to become competent as a priest. You will see a similar tendency where Buddhism has become more rigidified, so where it has become part of the state ritual structures. In many parts of the Southeast Asian countries, you will find the same pattern where what do? You do your daily prayers, you live the good life, follow the Eightfold Path, which is now reduced merely to morality and ethics. Do good, be good, and whatever particular forms it takes. And then there is this element of have faith in the Buddha. But what about the whole goal of the Buddha's teaching? To become free of suffering, to grow in consciousness, to attain to a poise or status of spirit or nirvana. That's left to the monks who have dedicated their lives to it. Us lay people, we stop short here. And among the monks, if you ask them what's happening, they're busy maintaining the whole monastery. Who's doing this? No, we have to do our work. It's that senior monk. He's the one who's doing the real sadhana. So it's down to a few who are held in the center, but then when it's down to a very few, you do not have enough people to replace them, and it fades out very quickly. You see this in the pattern of series of popes. There were popes who became entirely political and conniving, manipulating political heads. They were as if superstructures over the states, super empire builders. And then there were the popes occasionally who would pop up who had a deep mystical side. But they were far and few. Increasingly, it is the external control which tends to dominate. So moral conduct is sufficient. And what happens with moral conduct? When that becomes an end in itself, it becomes superficial. You have the pretense of moral conduct, and that's good enough. What you do privately is completely different. And the same with the emotional fervor. You demonstrate it in that Sunday Mass or in those special rituals you do. You go back and your mind and heart turn completely elsewhere. The first amalgam of religion, occultism, and mystic experience is disrupted. And there is a tendency, not by any means universal or complete, but still pronounced or visible, for each of these powers to follow its own way to its own goal in its own separate and free character. So what happened with the intellect coming upon this mix of the three things, religion, occultism, and mystic experience, the intellect sitting on top and crushing them out, forces these three now to break apart and follow their own lines. Now, as he says, it doesn't happen everywhere as three distinct streams. But the tendency is seen everywhere, and what may emerge may be a mix of one or more of these streams. So you may have a strongly religious with a mix of occultism, or a strongly occult with a mix of mystic experience, or a mystic experience with a mix of those, or occasionally a stream breaking out in pure focus. Pure mysticism, we don't have anything to do with religion and occultism, and so on. Now, having understood this, if you look back at the phase of all the religions of the world as they've been through this passage, Europe is especially interesting because when it happened there, the strong intellectualizing force, it was not happening with the same force elsewhere in the world. But it happened elsewhere in the world later on, and often with the first European influence and the colonizing influence. You see that in the Americas, in the native people and their religion and their culture. With the colonization came all these elements until it broke completely their own culture. And of course, there was a mass genocide which reduced the populations, and so with it, a lot of loss of the traditions. But the breakup is visible there. Similarly, in Asia and in Africa, you see the same pattern. In Africa, the elements again break separate, and many don't survive. In Asia, though, the survival is much more visible. And in spite of a very strong influence and the colonization, these things had held a certain force of their own, and so could last on their own strength. What do you see, for example, in the what we have described earlier as the Hindu space, for want of a better word, the whole Indian subcontinent, where you have a rich variety of seekings held in a common framework which can be called Vedic. There you see three distinct tendencies. One where there is the religious form where people fall back to, this is how we do it. And in the act of the religious form, the element of the spiritual culture is still there. It's not lost. So it gives to it a validity. When people go through those religious rituals, every morning you stand in the water, offer the water, recite your mantras, cleanse yourself and come out of the river, you feel the difference. And you know the symbol is not lost. You know what it is for. You're calling the sun, the spiritual sun, to enlighten your mind. You've done the mantra, you've felt its power, it's still held. Then there is the occultism, which has taken a different form. It has broken away, and in large part, in a reduced and maybe even a lowered status, survives in certain tantric traditions, where even it is commonly said, go to a tantric for an occult resolution. So if someone has occult problems, there's a haunting or something, go to a tantric, he will drive it out. Or you want money and you have no other means, you want occult access, go to a tantric, he'll do a prayer. When actually the content of the tantric ritual derives from the earlier Vedic insights and symbols. But now it's completely lost its spiritual content. I've shared before here this experience I had. I had occasion to meet someone in North India who came through a common friend, and he was somebody who was very deep into this, exploring all tantric practices, texts, and he had dug out many of them, looked at those rituals, gone through many of them. He wouldn't even say all the weird things he had done because some of it was a bit embarrassing or scary. And so talking to him, I brought this deeper perspective that Tantra actually represents this movement of self-giving to the divine Shakti. That's the basis of the whole Tantra. And the spiritual awakening and the self-realization or liberation that it leads to. And he said to me, I'm sorry, in all the hundreds of texts I have read, I don't find this anywhere. All the texts are about how to acquire this power or that power or attain to certain results or outcomes. Obviously, those are the texts he was looking for. Very distinct from those texts are the still living family lineages and schools of the Tantra, such as the Sri Chakra Puja, Sri Yantra, which are all entirely dedicated to worship of the Divine Mother through a ritual form of practice where you consecrate yourself to the Divine. It has only a spiritual component, nothing of the magical. So what you see even in the Tantric tradition, there's this breaking away, one part holding the spiritual, another part even declining in its magical power content. But all those texts, interestingly, all of them without exception begin with Shiva and Parvati, the Lord and his power of nature now. And Parvati asks Shiva, I see human beings suffering with such and such a problem. What is the solution for this problem? Can you please reveal and help humanity? And then Shiva begins to describe, Shiva says, for this problem, this is the way and this is the solution to overcome. And there's a whole ritual and process described. So the source is still given from the divine. And even in some of those practitioners of those types of things, their definition of Tantra is the knowledge that comes from Shiva, as distinctive from the knowledge that comes from Vishnu. There's some element of truth in it, because Shiva is the one aspect of the divine which is so compassionate that he will equally grant boons to the demons who pray to him, because anyone who needs help, he is there, and even the most downtrodden, he is there for all equally. So this is to show the separation. Religion, occultism, and the mystical experience breaks away. And in the yoga tradition, you find the pure mystical element held. Even within the yoga tradition, the specializations make for breaks. In the Raja Yoga tradition, there is the aspect of meditation, which is held much more. Hatha Yoga tradition even tends to lose some of that. In the Bhakti Yoga, meditation is forgotten and replaced only with a ritual and takes the form of religious fervor and ethical living and so on. In one of the lineages which is which had a strong modern force, which is a revival of the Bhakti tradition in a new form, in the ISKCON tradition. The founder, Prabhupada, was an exceptional being and with exceptional power and a mission to bring back something. And what was interesting is, he went, and his work was really to spread it in the West. He went straight to the most downtrodden. He went to the hippies, the drug addicts, and the most fallen, and brought them, awakened in them this bhakti and the turn to God and the purifying aspect of this. What was the reason? If you see what happened in the late 60s, the hippie turn was really a glimpse of a spiritual possibility. But before it could even prepare for the spiritual turn, the mix of vital desire and crude sexuality and drug abuse turned it and perverted it to the point of loss. These were people seeking the spirit who fell. And so he came almost as a vibhuti who came and took them into his fold, purified them from that addiction through the love of God, through chanting and bhakti. And as they came out, there's an incident narrated by someone, I don't know how true it is, but somebody asked him, how is it you initiate women also with these mantras? Certain mantras apparently were reserved for men. I don't know when that happened, but whatever it was. He says, no, I'm not teaching women. He said, but you just taught those ladies who were there. He said, them, they are not women, they are animals. So, very shocking statement. And he's asked, how can you say that? This is inhuman. He says, no. The sign of a woman or a man, and he lists characteristics, a certain ethical standard of thought and values. And he says, do they have them? They were just coming out from drug abuse. And he asked those women, do you have these? They said, no. See, they're not women. They're not human. Okay, he was a bit dramatic in his statements, but the point was made that a part of humanity, although aspiring for something higher, when it falls, well, it falls back to its animal instincts with addictions. And the attempt to rise is required, for which these basic steps are essential. So often what happened, because he was accessing that level of humanity who just needs something to hold to rise up, the formula he taught was very simple. Chant God's name with fervor, serve food to everybody, and look after the cows. It was a triple formula which he gave to many people. Of course, the institution then which built around him had a priority for these things. And there was, of course, a spiritual undercurrent which was given to those who were ready for it. But this became the first form. And you can see how there's a tendency for people to fall back to the emotional fervor, faith, moral conduct combination. And that's enough because it gets you out from the mess you were in and to a place where a little bit, a modicum of spirituality, as Sri Aurobindo puts it, that's enough, it is satisfying. But here is an amalgam of religion. The occultism is gone, a touch of mystical experience, a complete, so each follows its own separate and free character, a complete denial of religion, occultism, and all that is supraphysical is the last outcome of this stage. A hard paroxysm of the superficial intellect hacking away the sheltering structures that are refuges for the deeper parts of our nature. Now, this description is extraordinary and we will review it in depth later. But to complete the line of thought, this action of the intellect cuts out now, removes and reduces to this very materialistic and superficial form because that's all that it can do. And the refuge of these inner parts which had developed in these deeper parts of the institutions built up, they also tend to now break down. The result is, which he will talk later in the same paragraph, there's the triumph of intellectualism and materialism. Everything is natural process. But human search for something deeper persists. And when the time comes that the intellect fails, the promises that you saw 100 years ago when Tesla lit up the night, and the possibilities of physical science mastering everything and making everyone happy, when that has failed, and instead we have created weapons and divisions much worse than before. At that point, intellect breaks down. There is a turning to something deeper, and there is a turning to even elements which had been rejected earlier in the religion, in the mysticism and the occultism, to see what would be helpful for us now. That's what you see today in humanity. So that whole part is also fascinating, how he describes it in the rest of the paragraph. We have just crossed the halfway point in the paragraph. But what he will show you there is, as a result, there's a bursting out of new religions, new traditions, attempts to bring back the truths which were lost and reform them in the current context and in the current relevance, and often with a cultural local space which reduces the relevance or modifies it. And many of these traditions which I mentioned, the new awakenings, came at that time as the movement of SRF, which had a strong spiritual turn. The very word is self-realization fellowship. People who seek self-realization. And then, of course, there's the institutional content and then the deep practices. Or Maharshi Mahesh Yogi brought transcendental meditation. The very word is meditation which will transcend in consciousness. But then the institution builds its own structures, and that element is kept by a few. Or you will see other new movements, such as in the United States, this is somebody who was a bit of a genius who created that movement which became very popular in Hollywood. Scientology, that's right. And again, here it was an attempt. He claimed to have gone all over the world, gone to all the old traditions, dug out all the best of all their cultures, and now he was bringing it in the umbrella of science. So Scientology. And the best is there. And that became very popular because, again, it opened to a mystical possibility, but it had its own superstructures, which became a system and then institutionalized. And often the spiritual content was lost or became third, fourth, fifth, sixth stage, but you don't get it right at the beginning. You're too busy preparing a base before you can get the true spirituality. And so these are some things we will see in greater detail. But what he has described here is a fascinating transition of what happens when the intellect comes and meets all these preparatory stages. There has not been a smooth transition to intellect. Intellect has come with a force, a gap, and now it turns upon something which it cannot understand and begins to break it down. All this describes the phase of the last 200 years. Later, Sri Aurobindo will point out, from this, how are we to draw what is necessary, what is relevant today, what has nature brought us to in terms of preparation, what is the level of integration made from which we can then build to a more deep and complete leap. So we will pause here and dwell upon this, absorb the profound ideas and the big picture that he presents, and take up this more complex process of how intellect turns and breaks down these and what happens as a result within the cultures. We'll take that up next Sunday.